Hello everyone, I'm Saurabh and I welcome you back to the Digital Board series by Orchids Biosciences. This is the third video for the chapter How Do Organisms Reproduce? If you haven't watched the previous videos yet, I have provided its link in the description below, so please do look for it. In this video, we will discuss about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, in which we will discuss about what is sexual reproduction, the parts of a flower, unisexual and bisexual flower, types of pollination, that is self and cross pollination. Then we will discuss about the process of fertilization, and finally the post fertilization changes or the changes which happen after fertilization. So let's start with sexual reproduction. So what is sexual reproduction? Even in the previous videos we have discussed what is sexual reproduction. It is a method of reproduction in which two parents are involved. And these two parents are of different sexes. For example, if we take in case of human beings, one parent is male, another one is female. So the sexual reproduction involves two parents which are from two different sexes. One is male and another one is female. These parents produce the sex cells which are also called as gametes. So male produces the male gamete and the female produces the female gamete. In sexual reproduction, what happens is the fusion of these gametes lead to a structure which is called as zygote, and this zygote later develops into various other forms and finally gives rise to a new individual. So we can see that in sexual reproduction, two parents are involved which produce the gametes, and finally these gametes undergo the process of fusion. So let us try to understand the difference between the gametes here. What is gamete? So gametes, as we have already discussed, these are the sex cells. The gametes produced by the males will be different from those of females. For example, in human beings or other organisms as well, the gametes produced by male will be mostly motile, and because it has to move, it is motile, it will be smaller in size. Whereas the gametes which are produced by the females are non-motile, or they cannot move, and hence they are larger in size. So the gametes which are produced by the males are smaller in size. Because it is smaller in size, it can move easily and reach the female gamete. So the male gamete will reach the female gamete, and then the male and the female gamete will undergo fusion to form the zygote. Then zygote will later develop into various other forms and finally give rise to a new individual. So this is how the process of sexual reproduction occurs, by the fusion of gametes. One more important thing which we need to understand here is the male will have certain number of chromosomes. Similarly, the female will also have the equal number of chromosomes because they both belong to the same species. For example, in human beings, male have 46 chromosomes, female also have 46 chromosomes. But the number of chromosomes in the gametes will be half of that of parent. For example, if male have 46 chromosomes, the gamete will have half of 46, that is 23. Similarly, even the female gamete will have 23. Now, when the fusion of these gametes happen, this 23 plus 23 will give rise to 46 chromosomes again. So we have to always remember that the gametes have half the number of chromosomes as compared to the body cells. So this is about the sexual mode of reproduction. Now let us understand why the sexual mode of reproduction is necessary, or why is the sexual mode of reproduction important. We know that sexual mode of reproduction has comparatively larger number of variations when compared to the asexual mode of reproduction. This is because in sexual mode of reproduction, the gametes from two different parents are involved. That is, the genetic material from two different parents will be taken. So the possibility of having variation in the offspring is much higher. The accumulation of this variation generation after generation will lead to evolution. And in the previous videos, we have also discussed that variation is linked with the increase in chances of survival. So these are the reasons why the sexual mode of reproduction is necessary or important, because in sexual mode of reproduction, two parents are involved. So if two parents are involved, the chances of variations are more. And if the chances of variation are more, it is linked to the increase in the chance of survival as well. And if these variations keep on accumulating generation after generation, this can even lead to evolution. So this is why the sexual mode of reproduction is considered important. Now let us discuss about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. For that, first we need to understand the various parts of a flower. So for understanding the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, let us first discuss the major parts of a flower. In this chapter, we will be discussing about the four major parts of a flower. They are sepals, petals, the male reproductive part, and the female reproductive part. So these are the four parts that we will be discussing in this diagram. The first one is sepal. If we take a flower and notice at the base of the flower there is this green color leaf like certain structures. These are not leaf but they resemble leaf, and these parts are called as the sepals. The function of sepal is it protects the flower in the bud form. So whenever the flower is in the bud form and it has not opened yet, the sepals are important to protect them in that form. After sepal, the next part is petals. Petals we have seen in flower, they are very colorful and they are very brightly colored. They are very large in size. This is because they are necessary to attract the insects towards the flower. Why do they need to attract insects? We will soon discuss in this video. So the next part, that is petals, are brightly colored and are large in size to attract the insects. So one of its function is attraction of insects. What other important role does the petal have? These petals will be protecting the delicate structures which are present inside the petals. For example, this male reproductive part which is present inside the petal will be protected by the petals. So petals are responsible for the protection of delicate parts which are present inside these petals. The next one is the male reproductive part, and the male reproductive part in flower is called as stamen, and this is the stamen. The stamen is made up of two parts. The upper part is called as the anther, and the long stalk which connects the anther to the base of the flower is called as filament. So anther and filament make up the stamen. This anther will have the pollen grains in them, and these pollen grains contain the male gametes. We know that for sexual mode of reproduction, the gametes have to fuse. One will be male gamete, another one will be female gamete. So this anther which have pollen grains will have the male gametes present inside them. So that is why we call that stamen is the male reproductive part. Coming to the next one, that is female reproductive part. The female reproductive part is called as carpel. It is also called as pistil, but it is not always correct to use the word pistil because sometimes the meaning can change. So for the safer side, we can always use the word carpel instead. More or less the meaning is same, but to be on the safer side, we can use the word carpel itself. So the female reproductive part, which is called as a carpel, is made up of three parts. The basal swollen part, which is known as the ovary, a long part which is called as style, the upper part which is sticky in nature mostly is called as stigma. So these three parts, the basal swollen ovary, the long style, and the upper stigma makes the female reproductive part called as carpel. Now what are the functions of each of this part? The ovary contains the female gametes. So just like how the pollen grains contain the male gamete, the ovary contains the female gamete. The next part is style. The style is useful to connect the stigma along with the ovary. So it is a connection between the stigma and the ovary. Then what is the function of stigma? The pollen grains which are released from this anther, because this anther is having the pollen grain which has the male gamete, and this male gamete has to reach the female gamete. So this pollen grains which are released from the anther will be received by the stigma. So it is acting as a site of receiving the pollen grains. So the pollen grain which is released from this anther will fall onto the stigma. Then the male gamete in them will travel along this style and finally reach the ovary where the female gamete is present. So these are the parts of a flower. If we try to see the same parts in a real flower like hibiscus, I have taken an example here, we can label it. First we can see here the green color part at the bottom which is called as sepal, which look like leaf, and its function is protection of the flower in the bud form. Then this brightly colored parts of the flower which attracts the insects and protects the inner walls of the flower is called as petal. Now if we see, there is not only one sepal, there will be a group of sepals, and the group of sepal is called as calyx. And even if we notice, the petal is not only one, there is a group of petal here, so the group of petals is referred to as corolla. So there is calyx, then there is corolla. If we notice in this photo, there are some other leaf-like structures as well. This is an additional whorl around this calyx and is called as epicalyx. So we have seen epicalyx, then we have seen what is calyx. Calyx protects the flower in the bud form. Then we have seen what are petals. They are brightly colored to attract the insects and as well as protects the inner walls of the flower. Then the two major parts, the male and the female reproductive part. The male part is the stamen. So these are the stamens. And the female reproductive part here we can see, they are called as the carpels. So these are the various parts of a flower. So now when we are clear about the parts of a flower, let us try to understand what are unisexual and bisexual flowers. If they have any one of the part, that is either male or female, then they are called as unisexual flowers. Whereas if they have both the parts, that is both male part and the female part, they are called as bisexual flowers. So unisexual flowers are those flowers which have either male part, that is stamen, or the female part, which is carpel. So either stamen or carpel is there means it is called as unisexual. But if both are there, they are called as bisexual. So both stamen and carpel are present. So B for bisexual, B for both. We can easily remember. We have already seen one bisexual flower, for example, the hibiscus flower. The hibiscus flower had both the male and the female part. Whereas unisexual flowers can be seen in case of the cucumber plant. The cucumber plant have unisexual flowers. The other plants which have unisexual flowers are watermelon, papaya, and cucumber. Whereas bisexual, a very typical example can be the hibiscus flower because it has both the male part, that is stamen, and the female part, that is carpel. So this is about the unisexual and bisexual flower. Now let us discuss the entire process, how the reproduction occurs in flowering plants. Now let us discuss how the male gamete from the flower or the male gamete from the male part of the flower reaches the female part. So we have to discuss now that how the pollen grains which are produced by the anther of stamen reaches the stigma, which is the receptive part of the carpel. So there has to be a mechanism or some method through which this pollen grains which contain the male gametes will reach the stigma, because after reaching the stigma it will go through the style and reach the ovary, and ovary will contain the female gamete. So this pollen grain has to reach the stigma. So the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma is termed as pollination. And based on the fact that the pollination occurs in the same plant or a different plant, it can be divided into self or cross pollination. If there is a pollination in between the same flower, which is from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, this is called as self pollination. And if there is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower in the same plant, then also it is self pollination because it occurs in the same plant. Whereas if there is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower on one plant to the stigma of the another flower on another plant. So if there is a transfer of pollen grain in between two different plants but of the same species, then it is called as cross pollination. But one thing we have to remember while writing about cross pollination is that it has to happen in between the same species. So cross pollination will occur in between the same species but two different plants. So now we understand what is self pollination and what is cross pollination. So very easy to remember one technique. SP is self pollination and SP is also same plant. So whenever there is same plant, it is self pollination. Whenever there is a cross between two different plants, it is cross pollination. So now we are getting an idea what is self pollination and cross pollination. So self pollination can be defined as the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma in the same flower, or else the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of two different flowers on the same plant. Whereas cross pollination is transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma between two different flowers on two different plants belonging to the same species. So this is about pollination. So we have seen that how these pollen grains need to be transferred from the anther to the stigma. This process is helped by certain external agents, for example, insects, wind, water, and other sources as well. So these will be helping for the process of pollination, and hence these are called as the pollinating agents. So these pollinating agents will be helping in the process of pollination to transfer the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. So to attract these insects for the process of pollination, the flowers have brightly colored petals. So this is why the flower petals are brightly colored and large, so that they can attract the insects for the process of pollination. So now when we are clear with what is pollination, what are the pollinating agents, now let us discuss what happens after the process of pollination. After the process of pollination, we know that the pollen grain has reached the stigma. So once the flower recognizes it as a compatible pollen grain, the stigma will secrete a substance which will induce the pollen grain on it to develop a pollen tube. So after it is recognized as compatible pollen grain, a pollen tube is developed from this pollen grain, and through this pollen tube, the male gametes which are there in the pollen grain will be transferred into the pollen tube. So these pollen tubes will be now having the two male gametes which were present in the pollen grain. Now these two male gametes along the style inside the pollen tube will move towards the ovary, and this ovary will have a structure called as ovule, inside which there will be a sac-like structure called as the embryo sac. So this embryo sac which is present inside the ovary will have the female gamete or the egg cell. So let us little bit understand about the structure of embryo sac. The embryo sac will have 3 cells at the top, 3 cells at the bottom, and a central cell with 2 nucleus. So these are called as the polar nuclei. So the central cell has 2 nucleus, whereas rest of the cells will have 1 nucleus. So there are totally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 nucleus, and how many cells? 1, 2, 3. The central cell 4, 5, 6, 7. So there are 7 cells and 8 nucleus. So this is the structure of embryo sac. The 3 cells at the top are called as antipodals. In the center, this is the central cell. Then there is the egg cell. And finally 2 cells at the bottom which are called as the synergids. So we have to remember the important parts are the polar nuclei and the egg cell. And this egg cell is the female gamete. So this male gamete has to reach this female gamete. So through the pollen tube, this male gamete is brought and is released into this embryo sac. Inside this embryo sac, what happens is, first thing, there are 2 male gametes. So one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg cell to form the zygote. This zygote will later develop into a structure called embryo, which has the potential of giving rise to a new plant, a new individual. Now what happens to the second male gamete? The second male gamete will fuse with this polar nuclei. So the second male gamete fuses with this polar nuclei to later develop into the endosperm. What is the function of this endosperm? This endosperm will be providing the nutrition to this developing embryo. So we are clear with what happens with these 2 male gametes. One will fuse with egg cell, another will fuse with the polar nuclei. The one which fuses with the egg cell will develop into an embryo later, and the one which fuses with the polar nuclei will form the endosperm, which will be nourishing or providing nutrition for the developing embryo. So now we have idea of what is fertilization. So we can say fertilization is the fusion of male gamete and the female gamete to give rise to a structure called as zygote. So the male and the female gametes will fertilize each other, or they will fuse to form zygote. The zygote will undergo multiple mitotic divisions to form the embryo. and subsequently this embryo will develop into a new individual. So fertilization is a process of fusion of the male and the female gamete to form the zygote. So this is fertilization. Now let us discuss what are the changes after the process of fertilization, or what are the post-fertilization changes or events in a flower. After the process of fertilization has occurred, that is, after the male and the female gamete have fused to form the zygote, the various other processes which occur, let us see. We know that this structure is called as ovary, and inside ovary there is ovule, and finally inside that there is this embryo sac. Now after fertilization, what will happen is this ovule will develop into a seed and the ovary will become a fruit. So the fruit, that is the outer part, is ovary, and inside that there will be seed that will be forming from the ovule. Then inside the embryo sac there is zygote. The zygote will be developing into an embryo due to various mitotic divisions, and then this embryo will develop into a seedling. So this is what happens with the ovule, ovary and the zygote. So these are the events that take place after fertilization. Then what happens to the parts like the petals are there, the sepals are there, or our stigma is there, style is there? What happens to this part? So these parts will shrivel and finally fall off. So this is what happens after the process of fertilization. Now let us understand the structure of a dicot or a dicotyledonous seed. The dicot seed has two cotyledons. This cotyledon will be having the reserve food material for their nourishment and growth, and there will be a structure like this in the middle. The upper part is called as plumule and the lower part is called as a radicle. And on the left and right side there are cotyledons. These cotyledons are reserve food materials. This plumule will later give rise to the shoot system, whereas this radicle will give rise to the root system. Easy to remember, R for radicle, R for root. So we have seen the fate of all the parts. The ovule becomes into seed, the ovary becomes into fruit, the zygote which is present in the embryo sac will become embryo, which on germination will give rise to a complete new plant. And the other parts like the petal, sepal, style, stigma, all these parts will just shrivel and fall off. With this, we come to the end of sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Let us quickly recall what we have seen in this video. We have started with what is sexual reproduction, the reproduction in which two parents are involved, which are belonging to different sexes. One is male, another one is female. The male and the female parent will be producing gametes or sex cells. These gametes fuse to form the zygote, which later develops into an embryo, and then this develops into a new individual. And then we also discuss about the number of chromosome in gametes, that is always half. So this half and half will join together to form the same set of chromosome back in the zygote which is there in the parent. After this, we discussed about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, in which we saw the parts of a flower. We saw the four major parts of the flower: calyx, that is the combination of all the sepals; then corolla, that is combination of the petals or the whorl of petals. Then we discuss about the male reproductive part, that is stamen, and then the female reproductive part, that is carpel. We discussed about the flowers being unisexual or bisexual. If it has only one sex, that is either stamen or carpel, it is called as unisexual, whereas if it is having both the sexes, that is both stamen and carpel, they are called as bisexual flowers. Unisexual flowers examples are papaya, watermelon, cucumber, etc. Bisexual, there are many, and one typical example that we have seen is hibiscus. After discussing the types, then we discuss about pollination. Pollination is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma, and it can be self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is same plant. So if there is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, or two flowers on the same plant, it is self-pollination. Whereas if there is transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower on two different plants belonging to the same species, that is cross-pollination. After discussing the concept of pollination, we also discuss about the pollinating agents, the one which help in the process of pollination, like example insects, water, wind, etc. After discussing about the pollinating agents, we have seen that the pollen grain reaches the stigma. Then we discussed about the process of fertilization in plants. We have seen that how the two male gametes are there, and out of that one male gamete will fuse with the egg cell to give rise to zygote, whereas another one will fuse with the polar nuclei to form the endosperm, which will be nourishing the developing embryo. Then we came to an idea about what fertilization is. Fertilization is the fusion of two gametes which results in the formation of zygote. The zygote will later undergo various mitotic divisions to form the embryo, and this embryo can develop into a new plant. After discussing about fertilization, we discuss about the post-fertilization changes, in which we saw the ovule becomes seed, ovary becomes fruit, the zygote, which is a result of fertilization, becomes embryo, and this embryo can give rise to a new plant or a new individual, and the other parts, for example the petals, the sepals and all, they will just shrivel and fall off. So this is the entire process of reproduction in flowering plants. Now let us quickly discuss few questions from the previous years. The first one is, what is carpel? Write the functions of its various parts. Carpel is the female reproductive part. Or the female reproductive structure which are found in the flowering plants. The carpel is made up of three major parts. First one is stigma, second one is style, and third one is ovary. Stigma is the receptive part which receives the pollen grains which contains the male gametes. The style is a connection between the stigma and the ovary, whereas ovary contains ovules, and this ovule have a structure called embryo sac. Inside this embryo sac there is the egg cell, and egg cell is the female gamete. So these are the major functions. Stigma receives the pollen grain which is coming from the anther. Style is a connection between the stigma and the ovary, so it will be transferring the pollen from the stigma to the ovary. Then this ovary will be having the ovule, inside which embryo sac is present, inside which the egg cell is there, and this egg cell is the female gamete. And finally in this embryo sac, this female gamete will be fusing with the male gamete. So these are the various parts of carpel. Moving on to the next one. Distinguish between pollination and fertilization. We can differentiate between pollination and fertilization. Pollination is the process of transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma, whereas fertilization is the fusion of male and female gametes. So this is the first point. One more thing which we can write here is, the pollination is an external process and requires pollinating agents, whereas fertilization is an internal process because it occurs inside the ovary itself and does not require any agents. Then they are asking the product and the site of fertilization. The site of fertilization is inside the ovary, whereas the product of fertilization, that is the result of the fusion of the male and the female gamete, will give rise to a zygote which will later develop into an embryo. So the site where the fusion of the male and the female gamete happens is, in general, we can say ovary, whereas the product of the fusion of male and female gamete is zygote, which will later develop into embryo. In next video, we will discuss about the sexual reproduction in human beings. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you like this video, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel.